Hey horror fiends, this is Dr. Chris with Dread Central's YouTube page, wishing everyone a happy Halloween, and we thought one of the best characters to do for the Halloween season for our media to comic books comparison, our media to comic books history, is Michael Myers from the film Halloween. The movie Halloween, a lot of you are aware, was created in 1978, directed by John Carpenter and produced by Deborah Hill, and is the acting debut of Jamie Lee Curtis, with one of the finest performances by Donald Pleasence, who would of course come back in Halloween 2, Halloween 4, 5, and then 6, The Curse of Michael Myers. Jamie Lee Curtis would be in Halloween, Halloween 2, and H2O. That's right. I only believe that she was in Halloween 1 and 2 in H2O, because H2O ends with her chopping off Michael Myers' head. That's it. Start Reboot, directed by Rob Zombie. I digress. The comic books that tie into Halloween cover the wide spectrum of the history of the franchise. Now, they were started by Chaos Comic Books, and there's a couple of convention exclusives. There was a comic book packed into the 25th anniversary DVD, and then some comics by Devil's Due Press, where unfortunately that was the last we saw of the Halloween comic books. Halloween 1, 2, and 3 by Chaos Comics, otherwise known as Halloween 2, The Blackest Eyes, and Halloween 3, The Devil's Eyes, so not to be confused with, like, this is the Halloween 3 comic book adaptation, which was The Season of the Witch, which had nothing to do with Michael Myers. Now, the Halloween comic books seem like they try to bridge the gap between 4, 5, and 6 to H2O. In the first comic book, it's Tommy Doyle, who we last saw played by Paul Rudd, as you better know as Ant-Man from the Marvel films. This is one of his first movies. He had been in Clueless right after this, but Halloween, The Curse of Michael Myers was the debut of Paul Rudd. And it's always been a character that you kind of relate to in that film. Maybe that's one of the reasons why that film, despite how controversial it is, and a lot of the things it did wrong with the Halloween franchise, a lot of people like it, mainly because Paul Rudd's in it. I don't know, maybe that's how I feel. But Halloween 1, issue number 1, it has Tommy going over notes by Dr. Loomis and is confronted by Michael Myers. He goes after Michael Myers in Halloween 2 and is discovered by the Cult of the Thorn, as well as Michael's babysitter, who was the old woman that we saw in Halloween, The Curse of Michael Myers, and she's also still involved with this cult. If you remember, in the original Halloween movie, there were some bullies that picked on Tommy when he was a young boy. Richie Castle was one of them, and he was the kid who trips and then is confronted by Michael Myers, just briefly grabbed, and that scene apparently tortures him for the rest of his life, just because he does stare into Michael's eyes, the blackest eyes, the devil's eyes, as Donald Pleasence would say. These bullies show up in the Halloween 2 comic book. He meets up with Sheriff Brackett, who we met in the first Halloween, and he goes over the birth of Michael and why the town is cursed. So it really ties heavily into the Curse of Thorns story. Now, if you're not a big fan of that, you might want to skip these because they are heavily influenced. In Halloween 3, Lindsay, the other person that Jamie Lee Curtis's character, Laurie Strode, was watching, shows up, and Tommy is killed. And we discovered that the Michael Myers that is running around is not actually Michael Myers. It's in fact Laurie Strode. She's gone completely insane and become Michael Myers, apparently after the events of H2O. If you hated Resurrection, which if you notice I left out earlier, then you're going to hate these 3 books. In my opinion, and a lot of fans' opinions that I know of, Halloween ends with H2O. That's it. Then we have Halloween One Good Scare, which is a pretty much Sam Loomis story. It's the official 25th anniversary Halloween comic book, and it was sold as collectibles at the South Pasadena Halloween convention, and it takes place within the H2O timeline. A young Dr. Loomis is trying to follow in his father's footsteps and refuses to participate in an obsession that ruined him. A firm believer Michael is long dead, and is until a patient he takes on by the name of Lindsay Wallace is convinced that the boogeyman is after her. This also has a very kind of official ending to the Lindsay Wallace character. This is disconnected from the Chaos comic books, so I don't want you to think they're completely tied together. There's the Halloween Autopsies comic book, which is about a reporter following Sam Loomis and trying to get the story behind his quest to take on Michael Myers. The reporter is eventually killed. However, the story of Sam, it does continue onto the HalloweenComics.com website entitled Sam. It's a 40-page short story about Sam's time leading up to meeting Michael and what Sam Loomis did after Halloween 1 and 2. This also takes place in the H2O timeline. Now, what I mean by that is it only contains Halloween, Halloween 2, and H2O. Again, we don't talk about Resurrection. Those 3 films. There's no 4, 5, and 6. And of course, Halloween 3 was the Season of the Witch and not tied into any other films, with the exception of the fact that Michael Myers does appear on a TV for an advertisement for Halloween within the movie. Isn't that kind of strange? There's also the Halloween Return to Haddonfield official souvenir comic book. All the artwork in a lot of these are fantastic. For the Halloween Chaos comic books, the illustrations were written by Phil Nutman and illustrated by Justin Tano. Chaos Comics, if you're not aware, was one of the big comic book companies in the 90s, publishing Bad Girl-style horror comic books. They were horror comics for horror fans, and it's where we got characters like Lady Death and Evil Ernie, and my personal favorite, the punk rock vampire Chastity. Unfortunately, they only put out those 3 comics that I mentioned earlier. The Return to Haddonfield souvenir comic book was drawn by Derek Rook, who is a well-known independent horror comic book artist here in the Massachusetts area. And the unique thing about it, it also came with a soundtrack, Season of Horror, music by Stephen Romano and Kristen Lee Dukes. So you can play the soundtrack by following along the comic book. The comic book was also a souvenir guide for the Halloween Return to Haddonfield 25th anniversary convention. And in 2 more years, it is the 40th anniversary of the Halloween franchise. But Double Do Publishing got the Halloween comic book licensing, and in a great story by Tim Seeley and Hutchinson, we got Halloween Night Dance. If you can find the original trade paperback for it, I recommend the collected version because you also get an additional short story about a serial killer named Charlie Bowles, who taps into the same kind of evil force that motivates Michael Myers. Now, Night Dance takes place between H2O and Resurrection, unfortunately, as that Resurrection movie is part of the H2O timeline. So this is after Laurie Strode is committed. That's what happens to Laurie. That's why we have Resurrection. They didn't want to kill off Michael Myers because the movie made a lot of money and they could just keep making a sequel. What's different about Night Dance is it kind of takes place outside the Halloween franchise in a way. It doesn't really involve almost any of the characters that you associate with the books. It's a little hard to explain without giving away a lot of the detail, but it's a really well written story that I really recommend checking out if you can find the trade paperback or look in your old back issue bin of your local comic book store. Devil's Due Publishing also put out 30 Years of Terror, which is a double-sized 5 short stories featuring Michael Myers, Laurie Strode, Dr. Loomis. All take place in the H2O timeline. For fans of the Curse of Thorn timeline, they were supposed to put out Halloween the Curse of Thorn. Unfortunately, Devil's Due Publishing ran into some financial trouble and they were no longer able to produce that comic book. All we have is a cover for the Mark of Thorn. The series is going to focus on Tommy Doyle, who's being pursued by his editor to write a fictitious version of the events that happened to him. A story that will attempt to make sense of the madness that happened when serial killer Michael Myers butchers his way through the small town in Haddonfield all those years ago. As Tommy's story begins, he starts to bring his life monsters from the past and secrets that should have remained buried. The worlds of fact and fiction blur, leading to inevitable confrontation with the biggest fear of all, Michael Myers. Now, this was going to take place after the events of Halloween 6, following the death of Sam Loomis. This text that I am actually reading comes from Diamond Distributors, who are the distributors of all the comic books that you get at your local comic book shop from 2008. There's more to the story involving Devil's Due Publishing, but from the gist of the facts that I was able to gather is, again, financial trouble killed their company, and Halloween, the first death of Laurie Strode, was one of the final books they put out. They put out 2 issues of what would have been a 3-issue miniseries explaining what happened to Laurie Strode from Halloween 2 to H2O, how she went from being Laurie Strode to Catherine Tate. The short story I had mentioned earlier, Sam, also explains a little bit about how Michael found out that Laurie Strode was Tate. I mean, we saw that at the beginning of H2O, but this goes in a little bit more detail about how did he track down Marion Loomis, who was the nurse that we met at the beginning of H2O and also at the beginning of the original Halloween movie. You see how this all really connects together? They only put out the first 2 issues. The 3rd issue has never been seen. All we ever got was a cover showing Dr. Loomis with his scarred face standing next to Laurie's tombstone with Michael standing in the distance. I believe there's one other cover, but this is the only image that I could find. Apparently some of the pages were inked and lettered, but the comic book was never completed. A lot of fans had always hoped that maybe with Kickstarter these days we can finally get a completion to this story, but it's probably a matter of licensing. Those are all the Halloween comic books that I have. Those are all the Halloween comic books that I am aware have been published. Before Chaos Comic Books, I could not find any Halloween comic books, so I assume that they were the first company to put them out. And according to several websites, other websites, that seems to be accurate. Whereas Freddy, Jason, Chucky had comic books for quite some time prior to Wildstorm publishing them. I did get a quote from one of the people who worked on the comic books. It comes from Derek Rook. He says, "Working on the Halloween book, Halloween Returns to Haddonfield, defined what we were capable of doing when we were firing on all cylinders. The book was conceived, produced, printed, and delivered in the venue of 1 month's time. Pretty staggering because of that project. I was able to meet many talented people that remain friends and colleagues to this day." And that comes from the artist of the 25th anniversary Halloween Returns to Haddonfield souvenir. Thanks everyone for watching. This has been Dread Central's YouTube page with a little rundown on Michael Myers and Halloween. Don't forget to check out the rest of the videos we have here. Like, subscribe, and comment on the video. And please check out my show as well, Radio of Horror, on my YouTube page, as well as radiohorror.wordpress.com, my website, where I talk about everything that we're broadcasting for the week on Radio of Horror. Thanks everyone. Have a happy Halloween.